Every problem child is a child with a problem that no one has solved yet.
Oh, I really love that quote.
Right. I mean, think about that for a second. When a kid, acts out in class and we immediately hand them a suspension, are we actually fixing the engine? Or are we just, like, slapping a piece of black tape over a flashing check engine light?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's usually the tape.
Exactly. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tearing that tape off. We're looking at a really fascinating document called Bridging Defiance, Clinical Support for Student Behavioral Health. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to basically rethink everything you know about school discipline.
And it is a massive paradigm shift, honestly, because, we spent all this time agonizing over standardized testing or district funding.
Like constantly.
But under all of that is the raw reality of behavioral health. I mean, if a student's nervous system is just in constant overdrive, if they can't psychologically anchor themselves in the room.
The lesson plan doesn't matter.
Exactly. The most brilliantly designed lesson plan in the world is completely useless.
Well, that brings us right back to that check engine light analogy. I mean, think about the standard historical protocol we all grew up with.
Right.
A student is disruptive, they get a referral, they go to the principal, and maybe they get a 3-day out-of-school suspension.
Right, just out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, you remove the immediate visual annoyance.
Mm-hmm.
The classroom is suddenly quieter, but the engine is literally actively breaking down in the driveway. The traditional punitive model obsesses over what a student does. But the sources we are digging into today demand that we stop looking at the action and start relentlessly investigating the mechanism. Like, why are they doing it?
And moving from the philosophical to the clinical, that why often has a very specific name. The document centers heavily on Oppositional Defiant Disorder, or ODD.
Right, the clinical side of it.
Yeah, so if we want to fix the engine, we really have to understand the specific diagnostic criteria here. We are not talking about a teenager who didn't get enough sleep and snapped at a math teacher.
Or just, a kid going through a typical 2-week rebellious phase, which is just called being a teenager.
Exactly. The clinical threshold for ODD is way more rigorous. It requires a persistent, unwavering pattern. So clinicians are looking for angry or irritable moods, argumentative or defiant behavior, and a specific vindictiveness that lasts for a minimum of 6 months.
Wait, so a full 6 months, that's the dividing line.
Yeah, that duration is key.
Yeah.
6 months separates a developmental phase or just a temporary reaction to stress from a deeply ingrained clinical disorder.
Wow. And there is a massive red flag the source raises here regarding how that label gets applied in the real world. This diagnosis can only be made by a licensed clinician.
Which is such a crucial distinction.
Right, because you don't just unlock an ODD diagnosis because you hit 15 trips to the vice principal's office. A classroom referral count is not a diagnostic tool.
Yet, informally, that happens in schools every single day.
All the time.
A student gets branded as oppositional by the staff in 3rd grade, and that heavy label just follows them, dictating how every subsequent teacher treats them. But a licensed clinician is trained to look for what the text calls comorbidities.
Because ODD doesn't usually show up alone.
Right, exactly. It almost never exists in a vacuum. It's heavily intertwined with severe anxiety, ADHD, undiagnosed learning differences, or just profound, unaddressed trauma.
Okay, let's unpack that masking effect, actually, because the text highlights how easily trauma or a learning disability can just mimic defiance.
So it's so common.
Right. Imagine you have a student with severe undiagnosed dyslexia. They're sitting in class, and the teacher is going up and down the rows, asking everyone to read a paragraph out loud.
Which is terrifying for them.
Exactly. As the teacher gets closer, that student's adrenaline just spikes. Their brain calculates the social cost, and they realize, being the bad kid is infinitely safer than being the dumb kid.
Fight or flight kicks in.
Yep. So they throw a desk, or they scream at the teacher, and they get sent out of the room. To the teacher, that looks like willful ODD. To the clinician, that is just an avoidance tactic masking a learning disability.
Or consider the trauma aspect. Think of a traumatized student's nervous system like an oversensitive smoke detector.
Okay, I like that analogy.
So a healthy nervous system sounds the alarm when there's an actual fire. A traumatized nervous system sounds the alarm when someone burns toast in the next room.
Wow, yeah.
So a teacher just giving a simple, slightly firm instruction might register to that child's amygdala as a profound physical threat. And the child reacts with hostility.
And traditional discipline just tries to punish the smoke detector for making noise.
Right, while clinical intervention actually teaches the student how to open a window and fan out the smoke.
I hear that. And
Yeah.
clinically, it makes perfect sense. But let me push back on this a little bit because there is a phrase in the text that really highlights the friction between the clinic and the classroom. Won't comply versus can't yet self-regulate.
What's fascinating here is that recognizing that difference is the entire game.
But imagine you're a teacher.
Right.
You are trying to manage 30 completely diverse kids. The bell has just rung. You have 45 minutes to get through a state-mandated lesson plan, and a student is screaming at you.
It's chaotic.
Right. In that exact high-pressure moment, a kid who can't regulate and a kid who won't comply look absolutely identical. In the 30 seconds before the room spirals into chaos, the teacher doesn't have time to be a licensed therapist. What happens in the room?
The fact that they look identical in the moment is really the core crisis of modern education. You are hitting on the exact reason why punishing the behavior fails so consistently.
Because it doesn't address the cause.
Right. In that 30-second window, the teacher is forced into the role of a warden, just relying on authority to suppress the behavior. But if we recognize the underlying mechanism that the child literally cannot self-regulate, we realize they lack a fundamental cognitive skill.
They just don't know how to do it.
Exactly. Look, if a student doesn't understand long division, we don't give them a week of detention.
Right. We teach them the steps.
But when a student cannot regulate a spike in anxiety, our historical default has been to punish them for lacking a skill we never even bothered to teach them.
That is wild to think about. And we know the standard punishments fail. But the source material actually provides data on what happens when we replace reactive discipline with proactive treatment. And the numbers challenge everything we assume about school safety.
They really do.
Evidence-based clinical interventions outperform standard suspension data across every single metric measured by the research community: attendance, academic achievement, graduation rates, and future disciplinary incidents.
We are essentially learning that suspension is mathematically broken.
Yes, it just isolates the student, removes them from the learning environment, and lets the anxiety or the academic deficit compound.
And to replace that broken model, the text outlines a very specific arsenal of evidence-based treatments. One of the pillars is collaborative problem solving, or CPS.
Okay, how does CPS actually work in practice?
It directly addresses that won't comply friction you mentioned. It physically rewires how a student processes authority. Instead of the teacher or parent imposing a rigid rule,
Which immediately triggers the ODD kid's threat response.
exactly, sends them right into a fight or flight state. Instead of that, they sit down and map out the obstacle together.
So instead of a battle of wills, you turn the conflict into a puzzle.
Yes, it forces the student's brain to move out of the amygdala, the fear center, and into the prefrontal cortex, the logic center, to actually solve the problem.
That makes so much sense.
And then you pair that with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, for the student.
Okay, but how does CBT practically work for a kid?
Yeah.
Because it's not just sitting on a couch talking about feelings, right?
No, not at all. It's handing them a mechanical toolkit. It teaches their brain to recognize the physical sensation of a trigger, identify the irrational thought following it, and consciously alter the behavior before they throw the desk.
Okay, so you treat the student, but the text also emphasizes parent management training, or PMT, alongside family therapy.
You have to. You
Yeah.
cannot treat a child in a sterile vacuum for an hour a week, send them back into a chaotic home environment, and expect the school behavior to magically change.
Right, the environment has to support the treatment.
Exactly. PMT equips the parents with de-escalation tactics, basically shifting the home dynamic from purely authoritarian to authoritative collaborative. You are treating the entire ecosystem.
Which brings us to the massive structural gap, because we have this beautiful clinical theory and these proven therapeutic models, but the reality on the ground is stark.
It's incredibly stark.
A high school history teacher is trained to teach history, not to administer cognitive behavioral therapy. A school principal is an administrator, not a psychiatric professional.
There is a massive canyon between what the dysregulated student requires to survive and what the school system is physically built to provide.
And asking educators to just, do more with less funding and less time is pushing the system to the brink of collapse.
So what does this all mean for the school system? How do they practically implement this? Well, that structural gap is exactly why schools must shift from reactive discipline to proactive, dedicated clinical support.
And that systemic solution in our source material comes into play right here, because there is an organization currently building a bridge across that canyon for K-12 students across Georgia. It's called MentalSpace School.
And they are essentially embedding massive clinical infrastructure directly into the educational environment where the kids already are.
They are completely bypassing the old referral model. Instead of hoping a parent eventually navigates the labyrinth of private health care to find a therapist for their suspended child, MentalSpace School brings the clinic into the school district.
Right, the scope of what they're offering is huge. We aren't just talking about a guidance counselor popping into a homeroom once a month.
No, they provide same-day teletherapy. Let's walk through the mechanism of that. Say a student has a meltdown at 10 a.m. In the old model, they sit in school suspension for 6 hours, stewing in their own adrenaline.
Right, getting more and more resentful.
But with this model, by 10:01 a.m., they are sitting with a tablet, speaking privately to a licensed, culturally competent therapist who is asking, "What happened to you today?"
And that immediacy physically disrupts the escalation cycle. By intervening right at the moment of crisis, you stop the behavior from snowballing into a violent incident or a long-term suspension.
That is such a game changer. And furthermore, MentalSpace School provides dedicated therapist teams for specific schools to build long-term trust. They handle severe crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, and crucially, staff wellness.
The stat wellness piece is
It
massive.
really is. I mean, if we expect teachers to navigate the emotional minefield of 30 students, acknowledging their secondary trauma is just non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
But let's look at the financial plumbing of this. Because usually when you propose a massive, comprehensive clinical overhaul, the immediate question from the community is, who on earth is paying for this?
Right. The financial barrier is usually the graveyard of educational reform. You can have the best clinical model in the world, but if the most vulnerable populations cannot access it, the engine just keeps breaking down.
Well, here is where it gets really interesting. MentalSpace School built their model around accessibility. For Medicaid patients, the copay is $0.
$0. Let the impact of that really sink in.
Because normally therapy is what, $100, maybe $200 an hour?
Easily. Out of pocket, it's completely unsustainable for a huge portion of the population.
So families just don't go. But with this, they have entirely removed the agonizing choice a parent might have to make between paying rent and getting their child psychiatric care.
Exactly.
And for the rest of the student body, they accept a massive list of major insurances. We're talking Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, AmeriGroup. The financial friction of getting a child into therapy is virtually eliminated.
Which is huge because by removing the financial barrier, you allow the school to actually mandate and integrate these services. And speaking of mandates.
Yes, the timeline.
Right. There is a regulatory reality detailed in the source that turns this from an interesting theoretical discussion into an immediate operational emergency.
Oh, for sure.
The document notes that MentalSpace School provides full HIPAA and FERPA compliance, protecting all that medical and educational data, but it also explicitly mentions compliance for HB 268 in Georgia.
The urgency on this is wild. For anyone listening, look at the calendar. Today is May 18th, 2026. The source explicitly highlights that the compliance deadline for HB 268 is July 2026.
It is barely 2 months away.
Exactly. And Georgia's HB 268 isn't just a suggestion or some loose set of guidelines. It legally mandates schools to integrate baseline behavioral health protocols and threat assessment frameworks.
So administrators have roughly 2 months to figure out how they're going to satisfy a complex legal mandate that requires clinical infrastructure they literally do not currently possess.
Yeah, they are completely out of time.
The urgency to adopt a turnkey, fully compliant solution like MentalSpace School is just a matter of institutional survival at this point.
I was looking at the success metrics for this kind of clinical model, and the source claims an 89% improvement in attendance.
An incredible number.
My initial thought was, wait, really? How does engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy physically get a chronically absent, defiant kid to start walking back into the school building every morning?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's because you have fundamentally altered what the building represents to the child's nervous system.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when a student is dysregulated and constantly punished, the school building is a site of trauma for them. It is a place of humiliation, conflict, and failure.
Okay, that makes sense.
But once you provide them with the tools to self-regulate, and they realize the adults in the building are collaborating with them rather than acting as wardens, the ambient terror of losing control in public just dissipates.
The school becomes a safe environment again. Which totally explains the other staggering metric in the document. A 92% reduction in anxiety rates among the participating students.
Right. When you remove the fear of unpredictable emotional explosions, the kid can finally sit still long enough to learn long division.
And add to that an 85% family satisfaction rate. Because parents are no longer terrified of their phone ringing at 1 p.m. with the principal telling them to leave work and pick up their suspended child.
It really represents the actualization of a bridge between education and healthcare. And for any school administrator staring down the barrel of that July 2026 legislative deadline, the source text directs them to mentalspaceschool.com.
Or they can initiate the process directly via email at mentalspaceschool@shetherapy.com, right?
Yes. It is a pragmatic lifeline for a system that is currently just drowning in behavioral crises.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. To summarize for you, the listener, we started by challenging the core concept of the defiant student, realizing that behavior is never random.
Right. It is a mechanical output of an underlying issue.
We dug into the clinical realities of oppositional defiant disorder, exploring how the brain's smoke detector gets rewired by trauma, anxiety, and learning differences.
We examine that profound difference between a student who willfully refuses to comply and a student who simply lacks the neurological tools to self-regulate in a moment of crisis.
And we saw how the traditional reactive discipline model of suspensions actively harms the student, while clinical interventions like collaborative problem solving and CBT provide the missing tools.
And finally, we explored how MentalSpace School is stepping into the K-12 ecosystem in Georgia, replacing outdated punishments with same-day, fully funded clinical therapy right as the state's legislative mandates come due.
Right on time.
The broader implication here, the real reason this matters to you regardless of whether you have a child in the school system, is that behavior is communication. Understanding that truth fundamentally changes how we view discipline, conflict, and authority in every facet of society. When we shift our initial reaction from asking what is wrong with you to asking what happened to you and what tools do you need, we begin building a more resilient, functional community from the ground up.
That reframing really changes everything. And it leaves me with one final kind of provocative thought for you to mull over as we close out today's deep dive.
Let's hear it.
We are witnessing a massive, necessary paradigm shift in our K-12 education system, moving away from punishing defiance to clinically treating dysregulation and teaching collaborative problem solving.
Right?
But if this works, if organizations like MentalSpace School successfully raise an entire generation of students who understand their own nervous systems, who know how to self-regulate, and who just expect collaborative support rather than punitive isolation.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
What happens when these kids grow up and enter the workforce? Will our adult institutions like corporate HR departments, our management structures, and our justice system be forced to undergo this exact same paradigm shift just to accommodate a generation that flatly refuses to accept a piece of black tape over a flashing check engine light?
That is a massive question.
It's something to think about.